Before the United States ever raised a flag, fired a shot, or signed a declaration, it made a debt. Long before liberty was written in ink, it was written in ledgers. The story of America does not begin only with courage and revolution, it begins with money, risk, and financial survival. In the 1700s, the American colonies were rich in land but poor in capital. Britain controlled trade, currency, and taxation, forcing the colonies into economic dependence. Paper money was restricted, debts piled up, and ordinary people felt the pressure of an empire squeezing wealth from their labor. The fight for independence was not just about freedom, it was about financial control. When the revolution began, the colonies had no treasury, no central bank, and no unified currency. Soldiers were paid with promises. The war was funded by loans from citizens, foreign governments, and merchants who gambled on an unproven nation. Victory was bought on credit. After independence, the new nation stood at the edge of collapse. 13 states carried massive debt, currencies were unstable, and trust in government was fragile. That is when financial vision shaped the future. Leaders like Alexander Hamilton understood a dangerous truth: a nation without credit cannot survive. By consolidating debt, creating a national bank, and establishing federal taxation, the United States turned weakness into strength. America's financial system became its backbone. Credit created confidence. Structure created stability. From chaos emerged an economy capable of growth, innovation, and power. The United States was not built only by ideals, it was built by financial decisions that transformed risk into opportunity. To understand America's rise, we must understand its money. Because before America became a superpower, it became solvent. America was born in debt, not as a sign of weakness, but as a consequence of ambition without resources. When people imagine the birth of the United States, they often picture brave soldiers, fiery speeches, and declarations of freedom. What they rarely imagine are unpaid bills, empty treasuries, and promises written on paper instead of gold. Yet from the very beginning, debt was the foundation upon which independence stood. The colonies did not rise against the most powerful empire in the world with overflowing wealth. They rose with courage, desperation, and borrowed money. Before the Revolutionary War, the colonies already struggled financially. British policies restricted their ability to print currency and control trade, forcing many colonists into constant debt. Farmers owed merchants, merchants owed British creditors, and local governments lacked the power to manage their own financial systems. Money was scarce, trust was fragile, and economic survival was uncertain. When conflict with Britain escalated into war, the financial situation became even more dire. Once the fighting began, the colonies faced a brutal reality: wars are expensive, and freedom has a price. There was no national treasury, no central bank, and no reliable system of taxation. The Continental Congress could not simply collect funds from the people. Instead, it issued paper money, borrowed heavily, and made promises it could not immediately keep. Soldiers were often paid late or not at all. Supplies were purchased on credit. Inflation soared as paper currency lost value, yet the war continued because belief carried more weight than cash. Foreign loans became a lifeline. France, Spain, and the Netherlands lent money not because America was wealthy, but because they saw opportunity in Britain's potential downfall. At home, ordinary citizens also became lenders to the revolution, accepting bonds and IOUs in exchange for their support. These people were not guaranteed repayment. They invested in an idea, trusting that a free nation would one day honor its debts. By the time independence was won, the United States stood victorious but financially exhausted. The nation emerged not with riches, but with massive obligations and a fragile reputation. Yet this debt told a powerful story. It proved that the country had survived on trust, unity, and long-term vision. America did not begin as a nation of abundance. It began as a nation willing to risk everything, including its financial future, to secure its freedom. Economic control was one of the most powerful forces pushing the American colonies toward revolution. While the conflict with Britain is often remembered through speeches, protests, and battles, its roots were deeply financial. The British Empire did not simply govern the colonies, it managed them as economic assets. The colonies existed to supply raw materials to Britain and to purchase British goods in return. This system benefited the empire, but it trapped the colonies in permanent dependence and limited their ability to grow independently. British trade laws tightly controlled colonial commerce. The Navigation Acts required that many goods be shipped only on British vessels and sold primarily to British markets. Colonial merchants were denied the freedom to trade openly with other nations, even when doing so would have been more profitable. This restriction drove up prices, reduced profits, and frustrated business owners who felt their success was being deliberately capped. Over time, resentment grew as colonists realized they were working harder without gaining true economic power. Currency restrictions further deepened the crisis. Britain limited the colonies' ability to print and control their own money, creating constant shortages of hard currency. Without sufficient coins or legal tender, everyday trade became difficult. Debts accumulated, farmers struggled to pay taxes, and local economies slowed. Colonists were forced to rely on credit while being denied the tools needed to manage it effectively. Economic life became unstable, and frustration spread across all levels of society. Taxes became the breaking point. To recover from costly wars, Britain imposed new taxes on the colonies, including the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. These taxes were not just about revenue, they symbolized control. Colonists were required to pay for decisions made by a parliament in which they had no representation. For many, this was not merely unfair, it was dangerous. If Britain could tax them without consent, it could take their property, labor, and future at will. What made the situation explosive was that the colonies were already financially strained. Taxes felt less like contributions and more like punishment. Merchants saw their profits shrink, workers saw their wages fall, and families saw their cost of living rise. Protests, boycotts, and resistance movements were driven as much by empty pockets as by political ideals. In the end, the revolution was fueled by the realization that political freedom without economic control was an illusion. The colonies understood that as long as Britain controlled their money, trade, and taxes, true independence was impossible. Economic pressure did not merely accompany the revolution, it ignited it. Expand 3 into 500 words without headings. The American victory in the Revolutionary War was achieved not through wealth, but through credit, belief, and extraordinary risk. When the war began, the colonies had no financial foundation capable of sustaining a prolonged conflict. There was no established treasury, no stable currency, and no centralized system to collect taxes. Yet the fight continued because people were willing to extend trust where money did not exist. Freedom was financed on promises. The Continental Congress relied heavily on issuing paper money to pay soldiers and suppliers. These bills, known as continental currency, were backed not by gold or silver, but by hope in a future nation. As the war dragged on, the value of this currency collapsed, giving rise to the phrase, "not worth a continental." Soldiers often received pay that could barely buy food, yet many remained in service, driven by conviction rather than compensation. Their sacrifice was not only on the battlefield but in their financial hardship. Credit from private citizens became essential. Merchants supplied weapons, clothing, and food on the assumption that the new government would eventually repay them. Farmers provided crops to the army with IOUs instead of cash. Families accepted bonds and notes in place of immediate payment. These people risked their livelihoods on the survival of an untested government. If the revolution failed, their losses would be total. Foreign support was even more critical. France, motivated by rivalry with Britain, became the largest financial backer of the American cause. French loans, grants, and military aid supplied weapons, ships, and funds that the colonies could not produce themselves. Spain and the Netherlands also provided financial assistance, often quietly, seeing strategic advantage in weakening British power. These nations were not guaranteed success. They invested in a rebellion that could easily have collapsed under its own financial strain. Every major victory of the war was shadowed by debt. Armies marched without certainty of pay. Supplies arrived late or insufficient. Officers personally covered expenses to keep troops moving. The revolution survived not because it was financially strong, but because belief bridged the gap between resources and reality. When independence was finally secured, the United States emerged victorious but deeply indebted. Yet the debt represented trust earned through survival. The nation proved that it could endure, honor alliances, and fight for its promises. America did not win its freedom with gold, it won it with credit, sacrifice, and the faith of those willing to gamble on a future that did not yet exist. When the Revolutionary War ended, the United States faced a danger greater than any battlefield defeat: financial collapse. Victory had secured independence, but it had also exposed the deep economic weakness of the new nation. The war left behind massive debts, unstable currencies, and a government with little authority to manage them. Without urgent solutions, the United States risked falling apart before it had truly begun. Each of the 13 states emerged from the war burdened with its own debts. States had borrowed heavily to fund militias, supplies, and local defense, often printing their own paper money to do so. These currencies quickly lost value, creating inflation and confusion. A dollar in one state might be nearly worthless in another. Trade suffered, confidence vanished, and economic unity seemed impossible. The idea of a single nation was threatened by financial chaos. The national government, operating under the Articles of Confederation, was painfully weak. It had no power to directly tax citizens and relied instead on voluntary contributions from the states. Most states, already struggling themselves, failed to pay. As a result, the federal government could not pay soldiers, repay foreign loans, or cover basic expenses. Veterans who had fought for independence waited years for compensation, fueling anger and distrust. The government that promised freedom now appeared incapable of responsibility. Creditors, both domestic and foreign, watched closely. European nations questioned whether the United States would honor its obligations. At home, bondholders feared their investments were worthless. Without trust, the nation could not borrow again, and without borrowing, it could not function. Credit, the lifeblood of any economy, was evaporating. Economic instability soon turned into social unrest. Farmers burdened by debt and high taxes revolted against state governments they felt had betrayed them. The most famous example, Shays' Rebellion, revealed how close the country was to internal collapse. Armed citizens challenged authority not because they rejected the nation, but because the nation lacked the financial structure to protect them. These crises forced a harsh realization: political independence meant little without economic stability. A nation that could not manage its money could not protect its future. The financial emergency exposed the flaws of the existing system and made reform unavoidable. It became clear that without stronger central authority and a unified financial framework, the United States would fracture under the weight of its own debts. The post-war crisis was not just a setback, it was a warning that survival required change. The survival of the United States depended on more than victory in war, it depended on the creation of strong financial institutions capable of turning chaos into confidence. After independence, the nation stood on unstable ground, burdened by debt and weakened by distrust. What transformed this fragile republic into a functioning nation was not sudden wealth, but deliberate financial structure. Visionary leadership recognized that without a credible system of money and credit, the United States would not endure. Central to this transformation was the belief that national debt, if managed wisely, could become a source of strength rather than shame. By consolidating state debts under the federal government, the nation sent a powerful signal to creditors: the United States would honor its obligations. This move unified the states economically, binding their futures together. Investors, both domestic and foreign, began to see American bonds as reliable, restoring trust in the young government. The establishment of a national bank played a critical role in stabilizing the economy. It provided a safe place for government funds, regulated credit, and helped create a more uniform currency system. For the first time, the United States had an institution capable of supporting commerce on a national scale. Trade became more predictable, investment increased, and economic growth accelerated. Stability replaced uncertainty. Federal taxation, though controversial, was another essential pillar. A government that could not raise revenue could not function. By asserting the power to tax, the federal government gained the ability to pay debts, fund operations, and defend the nation. This authority strengthened sovereignty and reduced dependence on unreliable state contributions. While many feared centralized power, the absence of it had already proven more dangerous. These financial foundations encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. Businesses could plan for the future, knowing that contracts would be honored and currency would retain value. Farmers, merchants, and manufacturers benefited from a system that rewarded productivity rather than speculation. Over time, economic opportunity expanded beyond survival toward growth. The impact of these decisions extended far beyond the early years of the Republic. By establishing credibility, structure, and confidence, the United States laid the groundwork for industrial expansion, global trade, and long-term prosperity. Financial strength became inseparable from national power. The nation proved that ideals alone could not sustain freedom; they required institutions to support them. Through disciplined financial planning, the United States transformed uncertainty into stability and ambition into enduring success. The financial origins of the United States reveal a truth that is often overlooked but impossible to ignore: America was not born strong, it learned how to become strong. It emerged from revolution burdened by debt, divided by unstable currencies, and threatened by economic collapse. Yet instead of allowing these weaknesses to destroy the nation, its leaders confronted them with vision, courage, and difficult choices. The revolution proved that freedom could be won on belief and sacrifice, but survival demanded structure and discipline. Economic control had sparked rebellion, debt had financed victory, and financial chaos had nearly undone independence. It was only through the creation of strong institutions, credible credit, and national responsibility that the United States secured its future. Money did not replace ideals, it protected them. These early financial decisions did more than stabilize a fragile republic. They built trust, united the states, and transformed risk into opportunity. They taught the world that a nation's power is not measured only by its armies or speeches, but by its ability to manage responsibility, honor obligations, and plan for the future. Understanding the financial origins of the United States is not about numbers or policies alone. It is about recognizing that freedom requires foundation. The same system that once struggled to pay its soldiers became a global economic force because it chose order over chaos and credibility over fear. America's story reminds us that true independence is not only declared, it is sustained. And the nation that learned to survive through debt, discipline, and trust proved that financial strength is not the enemy of freedom, but one of its greatest defenders.